I think sometimes one of the hardest things, most difficult things to do in leadership is it's easy to accept or to understand, but to really come to grips with the whole idea that leadership is this multi-directional thing, right? So certainly it applies from you as the boss, influencing people that report directly to you. There's certain orders you give that need to be obeyed, whether you're in private sector or you're an Air Force pilot, right? The whole idea when you're talking about your Pentagon experience, leadership is also influencing peers where you have no legitimate power.
Right.
And a big part of it, it's also having the intestinal fortitude, the guts, whatever you want to call it, to effectively influence your boss, to challenge up, to say things. And I think it's very indicative of good leaders. It's like, if there really isn't disagreement, if you're not getting some sort of pushback, especially if you're making big decisions,
Right.
if you're it's really your responsibility to stir that pot. But just to think that what you've got is 6, 7 heads nodding and you've come to the right decision, usually there's trouble, right around the corner there. But that's a difficult thing, to build in. In your experience, how comfortable are people challenging up? Because you have a tendency to think of, military organizations, wherever they happen to be, is, well, here's the order. My job is to follow the order, right? But how much constructive criticism or pushback did you experience in your military career versus, let's say with your civilian transition?
Yeah, I've seen the same dynamic in the private sector that I saw in the military, is that I think once you get above, I don't know, let's call it in the military, it'd be kind of that major, that 04 level, you've kind of come out of what we call the company grade, you're in the field grade. What I've seen in the private sector is once you become really that, first time you're a manager, that you have to fight to make sure that people believe you when you say, hey, I want feedback, I want to know when you have a problem with what I'm doing, because our objective is not to make Brett or Sam successful. Our objective is to make the organization successful. One of my favorite Coach K quotes is, you got to play for the front of the jersey, not the name on the back of the jersey, right? And so people have to believe that. And I think that it doesn't matter private sector or military, that the more senior you get, the harder it is for you to get the pushback, because people are worried about their careers, they're worried about, how is this going to reflect on me, those sorts of things. And so it's up to you as the leader to create the environment, especially with those 6 or 7 that you do influence, because the bigger your organization is, the more critical they are, because they influence the next 6 or 7. If you don't have alignment down there, then you're going to have some serious problems. And so we've got to have an environment where we can do that. So you really have to fight for that feedback, and you've really got to create that environment to make sure that loyalty goes both directions.
It's reciprocal.
Exactly. But you can kill it right in a second. And so I would look for opportunities. I'd be sitting at the table and say, hey, we're going to do this, and here's the direction I want to go after looking at this, blah, blah, blah. And I would look for opportunities if somebody came up with and said, hey, boss, I think, da, 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 da. If I could use that person's method of doing something, or if I could say, actually that is a much better idea, we're going to do it that way. I know it's going to give me the objective the same way, but that starts to create that environment where, hey, the boss does want to hear the truth, and they do want to hear, other options for doing that.
Yeah.
The other piece that I learned, really not till I got to the Pentagon, it kind of goes back to a previous thing we were talking about, is I showed up at the Pentagon as a 2-star general, is that I found out there were a lot of decisions made by 4-star generals that never got carried out, right? There's a lot of bureaucracy, there's a lot of things in there that are going on that just because the 4-star said it, not all of that stuff happened. And you just have to realize that that's what the situation is. And if it didn't happen, it's probably because, maybe it wasn't a good idea, or maybe, or there could be just evil people in there that are trying to block it, but not everything they said happened. And so one of the things that, a lesson I learned early on, it's another one of these, one was more fun about flying, but here's another one. I remember one of the jobs I had in the Pentagon was Air Force readiness. So we had to report, are we ready to do our combat mission? Are we ready to do these things? And when I first got into that job, I'm looking at the data, I'm looking at things here, and I'm going, this is very thin. We do not have a good cause and effect relationship, which is really dangerous because you're putting a lot of money into this pot thinking it'll produce this result. And the data wasn't there to say, hey, we're putting the right money in the right. What we're doing is we were measuring stuff that's easy to measure. We weren't making sure that linkage was connected. So I went to give a readiness briefing to 4-star Chief of Staff of the Air Force and the Secretary of the Air Force, so 2 most senior people in the Air Force. And I basically went through our reporting system, and not quite this bluntly, but I said, we are completely screwed up. Our logic doesn't match here. We don't have a good idea on where the money's going. Are we measuring the right things, right? Because if you don't measure the right thing, you could turn the dot green, but not achieve your objective. And I got done with that, and the Chief of Staff, who's one of my mentors still today, he said, E.T., that was my call sign. And as a fighter pilot, there are many people who didn't know your real first name. And he goes, E.T., I don't think we need a lecture on how the readiness system works and blah, blah, blah. So basically, bam, right? And so I thought, geez, you know? But then I learned that every good idea has a gestation period. And so you've got to let it fester. And no kidding, about 6 months later, my boss, who was a 3-star, came into me and goes, E.T., I just came out of this meeting and the secretary said almost exactly what you said 6 months ago, right? And so your ability to convey these ideas in the right way up the chain, to accept the fact that they may not be greeted with great enthusiasm, but if your logic is sound and you continue to support that over time, that you will frequently see that it comes back out the other side.
Yeah.
And as long as we apply we all get more done if we don't worry about who gets the credit, then that can work.
That is a great soundbite. Any really strong idea, there is a gestation period, that it needs to go through, especially if what you're doing is introducing an idea that challenges the system, and to follow it would mean change. So there's that initial pushback, resistance, but by the same token, at the same time, there's also, maybe not outwardly, but inwardly, okay, I don't know that I want to buy into this 100% right now, but I'm going to put this in the incubator and kind of see what goes on with it for a while. Absolutely. Speaking to your military career here, Morgan, like what percentage, if there's a way to distinguish it that way, what percentage of what you know about leadership came from formal training like we provide, situational leadership competencies, versus on-the-job training? Seeing somebody that has one particular trait or something that you really identify with, and then just trying to model after that. So there's kind of the informal side to leadership development, and then there's more of the let me introduce you to kind of formalized thinking about. Is there a mix there for you as you reflect on your career? And
to me, certainly most of what I'd say the vast majority of what I learned was OJT, it was trial and error, it was feedback. Marshall relies a lot on the 360 feedback, and I had an opportunity to have one of those when I was a new colonel. So we had some specific leadership training opportunities. And again, we keep referring to Marshall because he's got a lot of good ideas, but it was just like he said, we can go in and have a 1-hour session, a 1-day session, we could have a 3-day seminar, but if you don't go out and apply that, right, and put it in some kind of a structure that you're really gonna take those concepts and figure out how to apply them to your leadership experience, then you aren't going to get anything out of that. And so there's a couple of times that I did have some specific leadership training. One I remember in particular was when I was at that wing in Okinawa, and we all came to a commander's conference, and in Hawaii was where the headquarters was. You would think that would be a really good deal. We didn't get outside that much. But we did 2 days on, really what it was about was how do you take your organization, which is by design almost pretty stovepiped. I've got an operations group that flies the airplanes. I got a maintenance group that maintains the airplanes. I got a civil engineering group that keeps all the facilities. I got a mission support group that does all the education and personnel and runs the dining halls and all of that kind of stuff. And it's very easy to let them operate in their stovepipe, right, and be successful in their stovepipe, but you aren't successful to the overall mission. And so that was a significant leadership training experience for me, because I took it back to the wing and I started to apply it. And this was a question I was going to ask you. You talk about situational leadership that's really guided at that first or second level of formal or legitimate leadership. How do you transition? Give you some kind of model to work from. And as I was thinking about, I took this from this commanders conference, I took it back to the wing, and it was one of these things where we called it strategic alignment and distribution. So essentially, I wanted to sit down and go, okay, what is the real purpose of this wing? What is our overall vision? What's our mission? All those sorts of things. And so now I'm talking to these 5 colonels who are all busy. They don't have time for this stuff, right? And so as I was thinking about our discussion today and thinking about the leadership model going from, directive, telling, to coaching, to supporting, participating, and down to delegating, is that my leadership style, the more senior I got, the more I wanted to be in that delegating thing. Mm-hmm. And so this was my question for you. As I thought about that experience of taking this back, I brought in a facilitator. I made them sit in a room for 2 days and really think about what this was. And it was really hard for them to be loyal back up the chain and support this. So while I completely delegated to them the running of their groups, mm-hmm. as I started thinking about, I'm very much on that directive side. Low competence because I haven't really thought about how to do this. I've been through this training session. It crystallized in my brain immediately what I wanted to do. But I felt like over the course, and it took 8 or 9 months, and I'll tell you how I knew when I was successful, but I felt like at different times I was working through all 4 quadrants of that, because some people would start to get on board, other people wouldn't get on board. And so I'd be curious to your thoughts on that, because the way I knew that it had finally caught on, and I call it leadership stamina, I had to continue to drive this, force people to report these metrics. I'm not claiming to be where Alan Mulally is, but it was a similar kind of thing where I said, like the famous story about his meeting where, hey, we're gonna meet every week and we're gonna put these metrics up, and it's cross-functional. I'm not so interested in what you're doing, I'm interested in how the team's doing and how your part is contributing to that. And if you have problems, I wanna know about it, and the whole story about, all those things went on in there. And so, this was a similar situation, but when I say leadership stamina, I had to keep driving this until it wasn't when one of the colonels came back, but below the colonels there were 28 lieutenant colonels that ran each of the squadrons. And I always had a meeting once a week with all 28 of them. And one of them stood up and started showing slides and talking about how he had reorganized his squadron, same thing, looking very cross-functionally, lining up to the wing goals and all that kind of stuff. And I just want to applaud because I knew, and that was the most powerful message. You know why? Because all the other squadron commanders, they could listen to me say it all day, but when they see Sam applied these concepts to his squadron and he said it's working for him, mm-hmm. then all of a sudden they go, maybe there's something to that.
Maybe there's something to this,
So do you see that as you go higher, that situational leadership model, it's kind of like in one aspect of my relationship with you, leader to subordinate, we're kind of operating over in the delegating quadrant, but over here, I'm still trying to get your support. I'm trying to bring you on board. All that is that correct?
Absolutely. The higher you go in an organization, a condition for those promotions has something to do with demonstrated ability and willingness. Mm-hmm. You're good.
Right.
You're good at something. You value, being a leader, a formalized leader in the organization. So the higher you went, in the organization, the more you would rely on, style 3 and style 4.
Right.
It's much more of a participative, delegative thing. But as you've already said, to use your own words, if you're going out to your key staff and you're saying, where are we? And you're getting nothing but agreement, that makes you nervous.
Right.